So tell me then, what surprised you the most in putting all of this together as far as the class is concerned? What is it that sort of shocked you about wisdom that maybe you didn't have before? Maybe you had a hunch of it, but
Mhm.
really confirmed it as you were putting all this together.
That is an easy answer, actually. By
Oh, good.
far, what I was most surprised by is the centrality of the temple to
Fascinating.
biblical wisdom.
That's good.
That was very interesting. When you go through the Bible and you look for places with disproportionately high wisdom vocabulary in scripture, the temple keeps showing up, and
Mm,
not just in one book, in many books. And uh, and this is just huge, right? Obviously, the whole temple imagery begins even in Genesis 1 in the creation story.
yeah.
And in a way, it ends in Revelation with this picture of a new heaven and new earth. And as God comes down to earth, that, the earth has once again become, all creation has once again become the temple of God.
Yeah.
And then everything in between, in a way, is trying to return to Eden, if you will. It's trying to return there.
Mm,
And the way that the tabernacle and the temple play such a pivotal role in that story of God wanting to dwell with his creation again, it's actually not a surprise that temple is such an important role. But I think
mm.
what I was surprised by is just how much wisdom is concerned with temple and
Fascinating.
how
Yeah.
it's a central piece.
Yeah. And so by that, do you mean, especially on a vocabulary level? Can you prove it on a vocabulary level? You're like, okay,
Absolutely.
wisdom motif. Okay,
Absolutely.
very good. So
So
wisdom
it's
terminology is all over certain aspects of scriptural stories that deal with the temple, in a sense.
Yeah, just to give you a fun fact, the Book
Yeah.
of Kings is one of the books that I
Yeah.
cover. And by the way, whenever I cover a book, I cover multiple sections, right? So I'll with each video, one of the things that I do is at the beginning of every video, I show you here are the number of wisdom vocabulary occurrences in every book of the Hebrew Bible. I have to preface, right? I have a methodology about how I go about choosing which Hebrew words to include, and I make comment about certain words that maybe could have been included, maybe not. But with purposes of our research, these are the words I chose, and you can see the total word count, the word total rather, the number of verses with wisdom vocabulary. Here's how it lines up. And then when we dive into that particular book, I actually show a chapter detail. You can see exactly how many hits occur in every chapter of that book. So you can see the distribution where it's showing up. And that's one of the factors that plays a role in choosing
Good.
what
Wow.
parts of this book are we going to kind of zero in on.
Yeah.
Now, again, going back to proper hermeneutics as well as common sense, that's not the only reason I choose certain chapters. We also want to know, okay, well, what is this book about? What is this book doing? What are some of the important turning points of this book? Sometimes that might be an introduction. Sometimes that might be a plot twist that happens. It could be a conclusion. So I also take that into account.
Mm,
But yes, I try to be very grounded here. And don't get me wrong, like I hope people use the research I've done for this video course for further studies, right? And there's of course a place where we kind of go from the ground level more into the atmosphere, into the heavens, if you will, as we're discussing the complexities of the
mm,
biblical story and all of its interconnected themes. But I really want people to see that we are not just leaping right to that level at the beginning. Like, let's trace the wisdom
yeah.
vocabulary because you could just say, hey, wisdom is such and such. You know what? I see wisdom in that. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree, right? You can do that. And there are many times that would make sense. But my methodology, and this might be, shockingly simple, but it's just we're going to go to places where wisdom vocabulary actually shows up. And so to
Mm,
answer your question, yes, the wisdom vocabulary doesn't just show up in temple scenes.
context. Yeah.
It shows up in a disproportionately high level. So in the book of Kings, the chapter that actually has the most wisdom vocabulary is not the story where Solomon asks for wisdom.
Mm,
It's not the chapter where he demonstrates his wisdom to judge and the nations are amazed by him. It's the story of the construction of the temple.
that's
That's
amazing.
where the
Yeah.
most wisdom vocabulary
Yeah.
shows. So don't get me wrong. We cover all those chapters. They're all important. They play a role. But that's just a one example I can give you about how central wisdom is to temple, and I think there's a lot for us to learn there.
Oh, it's so good because it really is true. When we think of wisdom, we tend to go to the story of when Solomon is asking for wisdom, and we don't necessarily think of temple. I think some people might, for sure, think of the wisdom it requires to build the temple, but um, most interesting on that is the connection that it really does have to the latter chapters of Exodus 35 to 40 with the construction of the tabernacle. And it seems that, of course, the Lord has put wisdom into certain people so that they can build the tabernacle, an abode for an abode for the Lord, a place for him to dwell. And just as you noted, going back to Genesis 1 with the creational narrative, I know some of our listeners might not know that there is temple theology all over Genesis 1. This has been talked about a lot by different scholars like Mark Smith, John Walton, many others, some others even before them really stressing this. But some of the motifs like the 7-day creation narrative, temples were often dedicated within 7 days in the ancient Near East. And
Mm,
there's the idea of a deity resting in a temple. So you have that at the end of Genesis 1. So this sort of imagery sort of conjures up a cosmic temple of sorts that the Lord dwells in his temple, but that wisdom would be at the core of that, right? At
yep.
the real center of both creation and temple theology. And that motif works. I know John Walton and others have discussed this in different ways, but that temple motif, you have the temple of creation built, but when you get to Genesis 6, creation is coming in on itself. The waters are no longer separated. The waters from above come down, and the waters from below come up, right? So you have separation of the waters in Genesis 1 collapsing. And then, of course, after the flood, the Lord separates them again. So you have the waters above again, and you have dry land. And what is that? You had a temple was destroyed, temple was rebuilt. So you have even that sort
Mhm.
of narrative structure that reaches all the way then into ancient
That's good.
Israel and even into the New Testament. You'll have that with our bodies, right? The body of Jesus himself, who he claims it to be the temple. So, but interesting that wisdom is at the very heart of that, and no wonder then that wisdom might actually go across Scripture in that way. So it's great. I love that your response was how connected wisdom was to temple. That's
Yeah.
great.
Something else I would add just really briefly to that, by the way,
Mhm.
is I think this is a two-way street kind of insight. Is on
Mm,
one level, we see that because wisdom and temple are connected in a way, temple can explain some ideas about biblical wisdom. But in
mm,
another sense, you can look at the other way, that wisdom is yet another thing that's propping up the importance of temple.
mm.
So, in a way, wisdom is explained more thoroughly by understanding all its permutations, and temple
Yeah.
being one of them.
Mm,
But also the fact that a major theme of scripture, like wisdom, uh, is itself pointing to temple, making temple yet even more important, in my opinion, than maybe someone may have thought beforehand, even if you thought it was extremely important.
wow,
And just kind of
that's
like
good.
you're like, it's kind of like what you're saying with the flood story. People don't realize how much creation and exile
Go
themes are
together.
present in
Yeah,
that story.
that's good.
And so when
Yeah.
you have something showing up more often
Mm,
and in these interconnected ways at major plot points, we should realize, okay, this is really important. Like here it is again, and here it is again. And in
right.
this way, it's like, I wonder if there's some main points that are trying to be communicated here.
It's
So
good.
that's something I want to add.